Welcome to the Inspirational Leadership discussion conversation. I'm excited to have a really good talk with our guest today, who is Rob Catalano, who is the Chief Engagement Officer at WorkTango. Wonderful to see you today, Rob.
Yes, thanks for having me. I'm excited for our chat.
So, Rob, tell me a little bit more around your career journey and what's gotten you to where you are now at WorkTango.
Yeah, so career journey, wasn't originally as planned, but it started off as literally I studied marketing. That's what I did in school, started working for a marketing agency. And then usually when you're working for an agency, you're not making the calls, right? You're not actually doing what you want to do with the brand. It's your customer's brand. So, I decided I'm going to kind of step away from that world and just find a job until I found my next career, the next, brand manager, etc. And I ended up at this little company that people know today as Achievers, but it was called something else different back then. And what's interesting is everything that I did from a marketing lens, the data, the motivation of why people buy things and why they're tied to a brand, that quickly changed to more motivation of why do employees go to work, what motivates them at work. And it really shifted to that same concept of marketing and the analytics to inside the workplace. So I spent 11 years growing with Achievers, and then and after an acquisition there, I was actually living in the UK. I decided we're going to start a company with WorkTango. So moved back home to Toronto, and that was kind of the journey. A pretty not a lot of bumps on the road. It was very consistent with 3 companies, but that's the quick and dirty.
I like how you kind of, as an afterthought, so I just started this company, WorkTango. What was the impetus to make you start the company?
Yeah, so one thing that we were always passionate about at the last company was around improving the lives at work at the end of the day. And so we wanted to continue to do something in that same realm. And in working with so many organizations from an HR lens, whether it was consulting or building technology with them, the one thing we kept hearing was when it came to companies hearing the voice of their employees, it was just a painful process. People would do that annual engagement survey. It would take 6 months to get the insights, another month for HR to put it into the leader's hands. And people were frustrated from this process, but continued to do it. So that was a motivation. If we can do something that would be, in many cases, better, faster, cheaper, right? How do you get the insights in real time, fix that problem, and start focusing on behavior change as opposed to collecting and looking at data? That was really where it all started. And so it's basically taking the exact same passion of what happens in a workplace, trying to improve that, and then that WorkTango was born from there.
Awesome. And one of the reason why I started this inspirational leadership series is that one of the things I've noticed is we might have CEOs who talk about these values, but they're not necessarily walking the talk. And I'm really interested in talking with CEOs who are walking the talk. And I get to be in a position, Rob, where I know you well, and I know that you definitely live and breathe these values. So from a leadership perspective, just starting off with, when you hear inspirational leadership, what does that mean to you?
I mean, I think it's building an environment where the other people on your team, I don't think it just has to be direct leadership, are driven and motivated to do something bigger than just a job, right? People, again, you may or you may not inspire them in specific ways in certain aspects of their life, but at least at work, inspire them to be better people, be successful, and really it's just building that environment to do so. It's funny, a lot of people talk about, and I don't know if you were going to ask this about my title, Chief Engagement Officer. The engagement that's my number one role as a business leader. Make sure we're building a place where people feel engaged, and my focus is on them before the customers or before what the bottom line says. So that's kind of how I visualize inspirational leadership.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I really love the title of Chief Engagement Officer, because it really keeps it for you top of mind, that priority around creating a space where, as you mentioned, people can be excited to go to work, do their best work. What do you think prevents some CEOs from really taking that approach within their organizations?
I mean, I don't know what prevents them. I wish I knew, or we would try and fix it all. But I think it's just sometimes it gets back to what people think they can control. And people think they can control outputs of an organization, like, customer satisfaction or like profitability. But I think they forget to understand all the inputs, everything that happens at an employee level every day, the behaviors that they conduct, the service they provide customers, the products they build or sell, etc. Those are the only things you can control. So I think people forget about the front end and focus too much on the data and the numbers of the outputs, like, again, profitability or customer satisfaction.
Yeah, absolutely. And what do you think you do, Rob, to really create that environment where people feel inspired to go to work?
Yeah, so one thing that I think, really resonates with the team and everyone we brought on is when we started the company, we said we're not going to have a mission because missions end. So what we said is we're going to have a passion, and that passion is to improve work lives. It's everywhere in our office. It's all in our clothes. We talk about it every single day. So I think with that like guiding light, I think that's what helps support aligning everyone. I think a big part of leadership is having that alignment to what we're here for, and it's a bigger purpose. So that combined with really good communication methods, I think is a really good way to continue reinforcing those things. So we do our daily tango with the whole team where everyone gets together. We have our cadence of, talking about what works and what doesn't, even in our own, sprints or those types of cadences. So it's really building it into the rituals in your organization to reinforce what's important. So those are some of the things we do here to try and really, make it top of mind for not just, us as us leaders, but all leaders that are here as well.
And what do you do for yourself specifically, Rob, to try to, because, as leaders, you're never done growing, you're always evolving. My philosophy is until you die, you're never done growing, right? There's always ways that you can evolve as a human being. So what do you do to invest in your personal development?
Yeah, so I mean, it is, I always, someone once told me the phrase stand on the shoulder of giants, right? So there are other people that are doing things out there that are interesting. So it's really finding those, whether it's watching those videos, the way they speak, how their employees speak about them. And you draw kind of other people's passions into what you do. And I find whether that's, again, reading or watching videos, I find it's really just keeping on top of what people are doing, but also making time for it. So even if it's not going out and researching that information or learning, it's making sure there's time in the day to do those things. So, I do have blocks in my day where I'll make focus on recognizing employees for living those values or other items like that. So I think it's also building into your day-to-day as well.
Yeah, and that makes me think of when you start to talk about, even from a leadership perspective, some of those values and those behaviors. What do you think are some of those really critical ones in order to be
It just broke up a little bit. I'm sorry, Kristen. Just what was the last question?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you think about being an effective leader, what do you think are some of those behaviors and values that leader needs to bring to the table every day to be effective at what they do?
Yeah, so I think some of them I think I mentioned, but one is there has to be a consistent communication, right? And I don't think you can ever reinforce those things enough. And I think when you build those consistent communication rituals, whether it's one-on-ones and other conversations with the team, getting together as a whole organization, I think that's really important. So communication is key because then that builds and breeds that alignment that you want from a team. I do think there's a level of honesty that has to go into it as well. So, we're very open about everything that happens here, why someone came, why someone left, the numbers that we have, how the business is doing. And I think if you don't mask, the bad things or the challenging things, you start building that level of trust. And I think that's where, everything kind of leads down to. At the end of the day, you're either building trust with employees or you're eroding it. There's no in between. So I think all these kind of communication and honesty and openness and just being vulnerable, right, and having hard conversations, I think really breeds that kind of successful behavior around what you're trying to accomplish at your company or at any company.
Yeah, I love when you bring up the trust and the psychological safety, and even really commenting on the fact that when the trust is not there and it's eroding the trust, it can have such a huge impact. What about in terms of other leaders within the organization? What do you do to help support them? Because one of the things I find is that with organizations, there's not necessarily specific time or training or development focused on them getting better and better as a leader. What kind of support do you provide there?
Yeah, so one thing we forget is leaders are employees too. right? Like at the end of the day, they have the same challenges, issues, they need to be nurtured. And too often we forget about our managers and our leaders and, expect them to just know it and understand it. So one of the things we really try and do is make that a priority in my conversations with them. So, for example, what we find doesn't work is throwing them in a room for 3 days, training them on a certain topic or concept, and then we think they're automatically going to go in the workplace and provide wonderful experiences for the rest of the employees. So what we try and do is make it more of a cadence. So every single week we talk about the team. We talk about what things that we might have been trained on, reinforcing those through kind of pulse surveys that we send internally. So it's really it's making sure it's on the priority, and we build it into our rituals and cues from a cadence standpoint. And then the other thing too is just give them the opportunity. Right? When I talk about goals with our teams and our leaders, I ask, okay, what are your personal development goals? So how do we infuse that into what you're doing as well? So the way we do our goals is, yes, there's corporate goals, departmental goals, individual goals, but there's personal growth goals as well. And then whether that's putting them on training or buying resources, books, you name it, under knowing what their needs are is the first part, and then it's easier to act on it.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, is just making that a regular part of the dialogue, and the fact that even their personal development goals are a part of their overarching goals, because I find too often it's only focusing on the business goals, but people want to grow as human beings and their whole beings. And it's not like, oh, well, just forget about the personal stuff. So when you start to bring that into it, there's ways that can be built into what they're doing on their day-to-day at work as well. So I really am happy when I hear you saying that it's very whole person focused like that.
And it's genuinely caring about that individual, right? Like that's where you build, I think, inspiration, where people know that their best interests are in your mind, and there's no lip service to it. It's genuinely like, where do you want to improve, right? Like, because if they're not feeling like they're going to improve or get better, whether it's professionally or personally, then they're just going to go somewhere else. So, we definitely try to have those conversations as much as possible, and also inspire them to have them with their teams and so on.
So Rob, from your experience, when you've seen some of the organizations that are not really creating as positive cultures, what are some of the common struggles you've noticed?
In companies that aren't creating a positive culture? I mean, it's kind of the opposite of all the other things I mentioned, right? They're just not communicating. They're not being open. They haven't developed kind of a rhythm in the organization to do those types of things. And I also think they don't reflect. So I think a lot of companies are always driving forward, but not saying, what did we do wrong? I use a method. There's the Good to Great book by Jim Collins has a really interesting thing there called Brutal Facts. And this whole process around literally sitting down the whole organization and saying, what sucked last quarter? Like, what did not go well? And theming them, getting the company, every employee identifying what are the most important themes, and then talking about why they exist and what we need to do about it. So it's that retrospective where I think companies forget to sit back and talk about how do we continually improve. They're too busy going in one direction. So I think that's a huge challenge, especially with high growth organizations, right? They're never just reflecting on it. And that's probably the primary one I've seen in organizations, or from hearing from employees. We're never talking about how to improve things.
Yeah, it's a big one, and I think what's also can be very demotivating is when the questions are asked and insight and feedback is provided, and then nothing's done with it. So then again, it feels like lip service. So here people are actually feeling like, oh, I can contribute. We're going to have some conversation. They're interested in what we have to say, and then nothing's acted on. And again, that transparency and open communication is not showing up. So absolutely, that's something that I see a lot of struggles with in many organizations.
It's actually, just to interrupt, that's actually funny. Like the motivation of Worktango was that's what we heard from companies. So that's what, not trying to pitch the company, but how do we get the voice of employee in real time, get the insights, not just HR, but individual leaders, so they can actually change their behaviors. Too often employees feel like whatever feedback I'm giving the organization goes into a black hole and no one's listening, no one cares. And it's, there's one term we say a lot here, that people don't have survey fatigue in organizations. They have lack of action fatigue, right? Like if you're not doing anything about it, we have some companies that are doing little quick pulse surveys every week, every 2 weeks of every employee. Like, isn't that aggressive? It's like, no, they're doing something. They're changing because of it. That's a big challenge. I think, it's a good point. People are getting this feedback, but not doing anything about it. You lose so much trust and focus that way.
Yeah, and that's great. I'd love for you to expand a little bit more because you are doing this with organizations and the work at Work Tango. What are you noticing in terms of the before and after, some of the big results with organizations that are really putting this into practice?
Yeah, so we're helping a lot of companies get a little more frequent in understanding the sentiment of their employees, and for different reasons. Sometimes it is things like engagement, which people know. Sometimes it's sentiment around understanding inclusion, sentiment of inclusion, or getting diversity metrics. So there's different reasons we use it, but some of the results we're seeing are obviously improvements in engagement at different levels of the organization, not just globally, but internally with a team or department. But what's breeding all of that is accountability. So many of our customers will actually give their insights in real time to tens, hundreds, or thousands of leaders in the business. And those are the people arguably that have the biggest impact on engagement or performance of their teams. So what you're starting to see is a lot more accountability, a lot more speed to action, and a lot less time, like I mentioned earlier, doing Excel magicianry or waiting for data from a vendor, and really focusing on the behavior change. So it's typically kind of what we hear, saving a lot of time, seeing impact on actual HR metrics like engagement and retention, and then some other peripheral benefits that come with that.
Awesome. Rob, when you think about your leadership journey, what have been some of the big lessons for you? Because, there's obviously the things that are going really well, but like anything, we learn a lot through our failures. I always encourage, I have her where I ask her every day, how are you kind? How are you brave? How did you fail? So that we can build in that failure is a good thing. And what did she learn through the failures? So what have been some of your big lessons as a leader?
Yeah, so I like having fun. I like, kind of having positive conversations. I'm a pretty positive guy, but I, for a long time, early in my career, avoided the hard conversations. And what happens is, again, it's just like checking in a year later. You don't know what's going on. You don't know the issues employees are having. And the reality is as a leader, your job is to remove those barriers. If you don't know about them and have hard conversations about them, those barriers get big and big, and those people get frustrated and leave. So that's one thing I've really had to work on and learn is like, it has to be all conversations, all open, honest, and just telling people how you feel. So that's definitely one that I struggle to. It sucks having bad conversations, but it kind of forced myself day in and day out to just discuss those, because it's like the squeaky wheel comments. Like, you want to hear that from customers because you can actually do something about it. Well, we want to hear that from our teams, but it's always not nice to hear. And again, you build a lot of vulnerability in yourself. But yeah, I struggle with that. But I've learned that I need to do it to be more effective leader, employee, partner, whatever it is.
So thank you for sharing that, because I think, Rob, everybody who's listening to this conversation right now, if they're being honest, have also struggled with that. And vulnerability is, I'm glad that there's more and more conversations happening around it and why it's positive, and some of the myths around vulnerability being weak and a lot of different things that are really not true. And I get you that you're understanding it's a work in progress, but what have been some of the kind of tactical things that have worked for you to make having vulnerable conversations a little bit easier?
Yeah, so one, it's similar to what I mentioned before. It's making the space for it. So whether that's setting up specific one-on-one meetings, putting that into the agendas, like what's stopping you from being successful? Like that's one line in our agenda items that we talk about. Is there anything I could be doing differently? Like, it's feedback is two-way. It's not one way. So some tactical things of like specific questions, specific cues based on a cadence, so that it's not something you forget to do, because when it's in your calendar and you have that commitment, you can't just bail from it. So those are the things that I more tactically do. The other thing I do is every day I create what I call a top 5. So the top 5 things I'm going to get accomplished, and I always make sure that one of those goals is a people goal. So it has nothing to do with our customers and our business and growth. It's just that. And sometimes that is have that hard conversation, or bring up this, or ask how their project is going. Those types of things.
When you think about some of the difficult conversations, sometimes there can be gifts that actually end up showing up with having the hard conversation. So what are you starting to learn the more you put the hard conversations into practice? What have been some of the positives that actually end up showing up that you might have not anticipated?
Yeah, so one of the positives is now what's great is I think you start building rapport with people where you don't even have to ask anymore. like before it festers in their head in a weekend, or you know what I mean? They're coming and they just bring it up and they know they can have that open conversation. So I think that's a real positive. But at the end of the day, we look at our own kind of engagement levels internally, right? We actually do a weekly pulse to understand the sentiment of teams, and what we're starting to see is, over time it continues to, kind of stay the same, move up, but at least not go down. And what's great is if we can see it go down for a particular reason, now we have some data to actually have that discussion. So, there's so many positives that come from it. It's hard to isolate just one, but those are kind of, specific things that come to mind.
I'm glad you shared that too, because that's such a great example, because what I've seen sometimes are organizations that have a product or service that they're using externally, but then they're not actually using that product or service internally, which is such a disconnect. And this is, again, where it's not walking the talk. So I'm very happy to hear that you are also engaging in the data and using the software and products that you're out there selling in the marketplace.
And it's so great because not only, employees kind of, how do employees discuss what you do when they're, with their friends, but when they're actually in it, using it every day, they have another perspective. And if you're building technology and then using it, for example, you get to see what works and what doesn't. And part of even our pulses is, how could this product get better? Like what does not work for you? What would you like the experience to be? So everyone's kind of involved, which is nice. And yeah, we wouldn't be doing ourselves a service if we weren't using our own platform internally.
So Rob, just to close off the last question I have for you in our conversation, if you were going to go out there and talk to another CEO and say, okay, like there might be lots of things on their list as they could do, but if there's one thing they could start doing tomorrow to really drive some better results in the organization, what would you leave with them?
I probably individually, throughout the course of, a month, 2 months, depending on how big your organization is, just go up to employees, spend some time and say, if you're a CEO, what would you do first? Right? Ask other people what their priorities are, and obviously what the outcome is. What would you do first to improve the organization? And if you leave it a little broad there, then you'll start hearing what's working and what isn't in the organization, and then you could actually do something about it. So I think it's a really good way to build that relationship, build that rapport, learn something about what's happening in your company, because typically people aren't telling the CEO what they think, and then actually doing something about it and rally your senior leadership team to move on.
Yes, I love the part two is, don't just ask, actually take action based on what you hear.
Yeah, don't not like the answer and then just let it fester in your head. Do something about it.
Thank you so much, Rob. This has been such a valuable conversation, and I think that a lot of people can see that just small actions can have a huge impact. So I hope that a lot of people listening today will take some of these to heart. And I really appreciate you being here today.
No, thanks for having me. I appreciate what you do in terms of just these types of conversations. We learn them listening to other ones. So really appreciate it. And again, if anyone ever wants to reach out and dig a little deeper, always happy to do so.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Rob.
Thank you.